Alright guys, before we even start this video, I forgot to mention 3 key things, okay? If you have a no start, like this one, make sure that your air filter is cleared out, pull it off, visually inspect the inside of it, make sure that there is nothing restricting it, clogging it up, because I've had vehicles towed into the dealership that have a mouse nest or things of that such, completely just blocking off the air intake, so the engine can't get any air, can't run. You also want to make sure that you have fuel pressure, adequate fuel pressure. Get a fuel pressure tester, test the rail if you can. Some vehicles you can't do it that easily, but make sure you have fuel pressure. Some vehicles you can also run a scan tool on it, newer vehicles, and see what your fuel pressure is that way. After that, you're going to want to make sure that you have ignition, that your spark plugs are firing like they should be, and everything's working correctly. And if you still have issues after that, then this video will help you out. In this case scenario, if your fuel pump was bad, vehicle sat for a long time, fuel pump didn't get it to run, these are just some other things that you can check from there. So hopefully this helps somebody out. Alright, so you've got a vehicle that's been sitting a long time, like this one, and the fuel pump's bad. So you've already replaced the fuel pump and you still can't get it to start. So I'm going to show you what to look at. Different things here, okay? So this vehicle happens to be very rare, hard to find. This is like an old mail truck. It's a 1991 Utilimaster UMC is what it's called. Anyway, so this particular vehicle uses a Chrysler 3.3 liter V6 engine, which is out of like the Voyager minivans, Villager, whatever you call them. So the story behind this truck is it sat for like 5 years. And when we dropped the fuel pump was definitely bad. Dropped the tank, pulled the fuel pump out, and the gas that was in the tank was nasty. I mean, it was I don't even think you could call it gas. It was just a nasty, horrible smelling liquid. So anyway, we replaced that, put the fuel pump in, put the tank back up, went to start the truck, absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. It would crank over. You could crank it all day long. This engine would not pop, would not try to fire, nothing, okay? But you'd come over here and also there was fuel pressure at the rail, 48 to 50 pounds like there should be, but it would just crank. It would not fire. I'd come over here, took this intake off, sprayed some carb cleaner in there, it fired right up for a minute and died out. So I'm thinking, all right, either we have a bad fuel pump again or something's going on. But like I said, come back to this rail here and it's still 50 psi. We have 50 pounds of pressure coming up to this rail. Bled the air out of the system, still had the problem. So next thing I looked at is the Injector Pulse. This is what you guys are going to want to do. You're going to want to get a test light, hook negative up to the battery. There's different ways to do this, but I hooked the negative up to the battery and probed one wire at a time. I had somebody crank the engine over while I probed one wire, and the test light flashed, which tells me that the injector is pulsing like it should. It's getting the electrical current through it, and that also tells me that the crank sensor is good. Usually if the crank sensor is bad, you won't have any pulse right here. If you don't have a pulse here, if you have no electrical current going through this to the injectors, first thing you're going to want to do is look into the crank sensor, and then kind of go from there. There's other steps from there that could cause that type of issue. But anyway, so we're getting fuel pressure, we're getting injector pulse, but this thing still would not start. Didn't act like it wanted to start, nothing. So I went around, kind of checked all the connections, make sure everything's good. The fuel pump, obviously it's working. We got fuel pressure, like I said. And the next step after that, I wanted to make sure that the injectors were working, okay? Now, like I said, this vehicle's been sitting a long time with really bad gas in it, okay? So what that means is, for a very long time, there's gas in this rail right here, sitting in these injectors that was gumming everything up, okay? So what I did is I removed this intake, not hard to do, pulled that out, and what I did is I slid the fuel rail out, and I looked at the injectors, and I could see that each one of them were nasty. I had somebody go in, crank it over, and there was no fuel spray coming out of these injectors. They were clicking, so that means the injector pulse was sending power to the injector. The injectors were trying to open, but because of how clogged up they were with old gummed up gas, there was no fuel actually getting through the injector into the engine. So I pulled them all out. This is what the injectors look like. That's the bottom side that sprays into the cylinder. That's the housing that's pretty corroded, nasty looking, but this right here was the problem, and I wish you guys could see into there. It's just filled with crap, you know, from old nasty gas. These are bad, they're clogged solid. So I replaced them with new ones, and I got in the truck. This is our result. Starts right up. So if you've had a vehicle that's sat for a long time, you did the fuel pump, it's still not starting, you're going to want to look at your injectors. Like I said, start with the Injector Pulse. Make sure that that's working, because if you have no Injector Pulse, crank sensor, there's a couple other things that'll cause that, but start with the crank sensor. Sometimes you can get in your car, and if you have a tachometer that shows your RPMs, if you crank over the engine, and your tachometer should raise a little bit. As soon as you start cranking it over, your tachometer will start raising up, the needle, okay? If it's not doing anything, then you probably have a bad crank sensor. That's more so on some of the older vehicles. I don't know if it would still do it on some newer ones, but regardless, if you're having this issue, check into your injectors. Don't give up on it. I've read all kinds of other stories online of people who just completely gave up on their no start and sold their vehicle, and somebody else got it running. But here you go, this is it right here. Process of elimination. You got to go through it, have patience, and you'll get it running.